In this lecture, we'll be adding our created script into Google Sheets. Many people don't take advantage of scripts in Google Sheets. If you have, you're ahead of the curve and already know their power. If this is something new for you, get ready to expand your capabilities. By the end of this lecture, you'll start thinking of more ways to use scripts in your own Google Sheets. And of course, it's free. There's no charge for writing and using your own scripts. You can also create scripts in tools like Airtable, but they charge for using scripts. Google Sheets doesn't. This is going to be an exciting lecture, so let's dive in. We're going to start with the Google Sheet we created earlier, the one with the reviews that we pasted in. Right now, everything is just as we left it, but that will change by the end of this lecture once we've created our script. To begin creating our script, what you'll want to do is click Extensions along the top, and then from there, click Apps Script. That will take you to a page that looks like this, and this is where we will input our code. You might not have visited this area of Google Sheets before, but as I mentioned, it's where you can create scripts to use in your Google Sheet. First things first, let's rename the project. Now I'm going to rename it to something simple like Reviews. Simple as that. Next, we'll rename the code file that we'll be working in. And you can see that on the left under Files. And we can click the three dots to rename it. And I'm going to rename this similarly to something simple. So let's rename it to Reviews _ replies and then ChatGPT. There we go. Now, if there's anything in the code area, as you can see, we have an empty function here. We can go ahead and delete it. We're creating our function from scratch without any template code. Now, to help you clearly understand the code that we're going to use, I'm going to paste all of it in. Then I'm going to walk through it step by step with you and explain each line. That way, you'll know what each part of the code does and why it's included, instead of just watching me type it out. Now, the code that we're going to use is similar to the code generated in ChatGPT in the previous lecture, and it's JavaScript code. Now, personally, I prefer automating stuff and reading Python code because it's just easier for me to comprehend. But in Google Sheets, we must work with JavaScript. So if you're a JavaScript programmer, you might find some improvements to this code. In fact, I'm sure you will. But the most important thing is that the code works. So let me now paste in the script that we generated, and I'll go into explaining all of it step by step. So let's start from the top with the function, which we named ChatGPT, and that takes an argument, a string called prompt. I'll now walk through the function and explore what we've done here, going through everything so you understand why everything is set the way it is. So let's walk through it. So we have created within this function 5 constant variables. So we have const payload, const options, const response, const data, and const message. Those are the 5 constant variables within this one function that we've created. If you're not familiar with constant variables, they're a type of variable that can't be modified after they're initialized. Trying to change or reassign them will result in an error. Constant variables are really helpful when you want to declare values that shouldn't change. For example, like an API key. In our project, we've used it in a slightly different structure for readability and simplicity, but that's how they're supposed to be used. Now that you understand more about what constant variables are, let's dive into the first one and explain its inner workings. So we begin with the first constant variable, which is called payload. Payload refers to the data transmitted or carried by a message or packet. Now, we're not going to get into the technical details of that, but rather focus on the contents inside of this variable. So if you followed along with the other projects, you might recognize some terms. So let's go through them and I'll explain each one as I've promised. So first we have model, which you can see here. this is where we define the version of OpenAI that we want to use. We specify the model for ChatGPT, which is GPT 3.5 Turbo. And again, all of this can be found in the OpenAI documentation. I didn't invent anything new here. Next, below that, we have messages. This is an array of 2 objects. And each object represents a message in the conversation with ChatGPT. As you can see here, the first object that we have represents the system role. With the role set for the first object, we then provide the content below it. And if you've completed other projects in this course or the section on prompt engineering, this should be familiar. We set a specific role for the system to act out. Below that, we set a role for the user. And again, it's set inside the curly braces. And this time, the content is the prompt. Moving down, still within the payload variable, we have temperature, which is set to 1. Now, you would have come across this in other projects. The only difference here is that we're writing code to access the API, whereas with tools like Zapier, we didn't have to enter any code. The tool handled it based on our inputs. But seeing the raw code like this is valuable, as it gives you a deeper understanding. So I've set the temperature to 1 as mentioned, which means the output will be somewhere between creative and conservative. And next you can see that I've set max tokens to 60. This number will vary depending on your project. We want something long enough for this project, but not too long. We don't want to make frequent, expensive calls to the API. So 60 is a good number for this project. As I've mentioned before, you'll need to experiment with your project to find the right settings. So that covers the first variable in our function, which is payload. As I've already mentioned, everything you see here is in the documentation. It's just customized for this project. There's no mystery to it. It's all clearly documented. The key is understanding how to read and implement everything that's in the documentation, but OpenAI do a great job of explaining everything very clearly. Alright, let's move on to the next constant variable that I've created, which is options. This variable refers to the properties used to customize the behavior of our HTTP request. Remember, we're using an API here, so we're making a request to it. As you'll see, this variable contains several properties, and again, I'll go through them and explain them. So let's start at the top with method, which is set to post. The alternative would be get. So that's the type of a HTTP method that we want to use. Next, we have content type, and that we can see is set to JSON. Below that, we have headers, which is very important also. So this object actually contains the authorization header with the bearer token. In other words, this is where we enter our key to access the API. So we have bearer, and then what comes after the plus sign is our unique API key, which we can find inside of our OpenAI account. And if you've gone through the other projects, you'll know how to find your API key in OpenAI. And remember, never share it with anyone else. Of course, you can see mine, but I will be removing that after. And before we finish defining this variable, we define the payload and reference the payload variable that we initially set up between the brackets. Now, if you're unfamiliar with JSON.stringify and wondering what it is, let me briefly explain it for you. So it's a built-in JavaScript method that converts an object or value into a JSON string. It's commonly used when transmitting data between a client and a server in applications. And JSON, for those who might not know, is a data format that's easily readable for us humans, plus it's easier to write, parse, and work with JSON files. And so with the options variable covered, we have the final 3, which are all one-liners, but still they're extremely essential. So let me go over them with you now. So the first is response on line 28. It's in this part of the code that our HTTP post request is sent to the OpenAI API endpoint. More specifically, it sends it to the endpoint that we've defined, which you can see right here, and we want the completions endpoint, not chat. This part of the code sends our HTTP request, our post request, to the OpenAI API. And more specifically, it sends it to the endpoint that we define here. So here we can see the API endpoint URL. And then after the comma, you'll see that we pass in the options, which refers to the options const variable that we defined just above. So we pass in those settings. Next up, we have data. In this part of the code, the response content is passed as a JSON object, and this makes the response easier for us to work with, and that leads to the final const variable, which is message. And this extracts the content of the first object in the choices array of the data object. This is where the output, meaning the response from ChatGPT, is stored. Again, all of this is in the ChatGPT documentation. And lastly, we have the return message. And that wraps up the function to create a specific output for us. So once you've done following along, you can then save your script. And now comes the exciting part, using what we've built. So for this, what we'll want to do is return to our Google Sheet. Now so far, we have the reviews in the first column, as you can see, but nothing in the second. And remember, what we want in the second column are replies to the reviews. The script we created will do that. So we can now call it. Let me show you how. So I'm clicking into the first reply cell, and I'm going to enter the equal sign because we're going to build out a Google formula to call the script that we created by the name of its function. So we'll now want to enter ChatGPT exactly as how we defined the function name in the script, with 2 brackets. Like I just said, we must define it exactly how we created the function name. So we have ChatGPT with a capital C and then GPT also in capitals. And by calling that function, it will then run everything we defined inside of it. Now, of course, we must pass in the cell we want it to review. So I'm going to enter A2. And now before pressing enter, notice how this Google Sheet formula follows the structure of the function that we created. We have the function name, and in between the brackets, we have the prompt, and in this case, we're calling cell A2. And now I'll press enter. And within moments, if you set your script up correctly, you'll see an output generated from a call to the ChatGPT API, and I'll just expand the column so we can see all of it. So it says, thank you so much for taking my course and leaving such a positive review. I'm really glad to hear that you found it helpful and informative. Keep up the great work. So that is in first person. It is pretty casual, and that's exactly what we wanted, and that's exactly how we wanted it worded. And what I can now do is highlight this cell and then copy it over all of the others. And then within moments, we'll get replies to every review that we pasted in, and that is calling the ChatGPT API through the function that we defined. So here we can see a reply to the review in cell A3. So thanks for your feedback. I understand about the pace, but I'm glad to hear that you like the course, and so on. So you can see how these sound human by the prompt that we defined, and of course that we put inside the function. And here we have kind of a negative review, so in cell A4. Now I hope this isn't the worst course you've ever taken, but we can see a reply that gets generated for that. So I'm sorry to hear that you didn't enjoy the course. Can you please give me some feedback, and so on. This is really magic, and it can save you a lot of work. So imagine that you have hundreds of reviews or something else that you need to reply to. You can basically just do something like this, and of course you might need to change the function and change a few settings, but this is the shell of the structure that you'll need to follow. I really hope you enjoyed this lecture. It may have been a lot to go through, especially if you're unfamiliar with code, But I wanted to show you how you can actually use this technology to really level up your skills and avoid paying for scripts in tools like Airtable. Now, if you still need clarification about some parts of the code that we created, so any part of this script, what you can actually do is paste it into ChatGPT and ask it to explain that specific part of the code for you. So use everything that you've learned here to become really powerful with these tools. And of course, if you do have any other questions, I welcome them in the discussion board. But please first review the FAQ section at the end of this course because your answer might already be there. But I invite you to join me in the following lecture where I'll give you a bird's eye view of this project. I'll see you there.